Hello, you're listening to the podcast of the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. I'm your host, Raphael Kachatourian. With us today is Matt Schaefer. Matt is a postdoctoral fellow with the Mitchell Center, having earned a PhD in political theory from Yale. His current research focuses on debates about the history and usages of violence and the politics of language, and specifically the violence of language as it is situated within contemporary technological capitalism and the information age. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, why don't we begin by talking a little bit about your current work? Could you give us a general overview of some of the questions or problems that you've been focusing on over the last couple of years?
Yeah. So what I've been doing lately is turning my dissertation project into a book. And the book is called "What Violence Was: An Essay on the Limits of Political Language." And this project sort of tracks the emergence and the development of a specific kind of conversation or preoccupation in American social and political theory and philosophy over the past 50 or 60 years. And basically that's the problem of like knowing what it is that counts as violence in the first place, right? Like political theory and political philosophy, these fields have always been concerned with questions about violence, with its legitimacy, with its justification, with its meaning as a historical phenomenon, its significance as the thing that the state tries to protect us from. Right, this goes back to the origins of the social contract tradition and Hobbes and Locke. But starting at the end of the 1960s, there was a real shift in how Anglophone and especially American political thought took up these questions of violence, where suddenly the question was no longer what should we do about violence in politics. The question became what is violence in the first place. And so I look at why that new question started to be asked. I argue that it has to do with the significance of the conceptual and theoretical and political insights of the nonviolence tradition that had come to prominence in the 20th century. And I look at the uses to which the resulting new questions could be turned. So in particular, I dedicate a lot of attention to the rise of new conceptualizations of phenomena such as structural violence, sexual violence, epistemic and linguistic violence. All of those terms are really common today, and they all refer to phenomena that have been sort of contested and understood in particular ways for much longer. But those specific phrases like structural violence or linguistic violence are actually relatively new terms. And I'm interested in why it is that violence became a kind of master concept for these conversations, in what that made it possible as a new sort of conceptualization, what that made it possible for political thinkers to sort of do and think about, and also what it made it harder to account for or more difficult to see. And so my interest in the politics of language in particular really grows out of this broader interest in the history of debates about violence, how we should understand violence. What I track in my book project about violence is that the debates about violence have always been structured by a particular sort of internal tension. There are two contending social tasks that people want to use the language of violence for. One is the critique of systemic power, right? The structural violence language is almost a pure case of this. And the other is the regulation or the redress of harmful behaviors. In some areas, like in feminist accounts of sexual violence, both power and behavior were always at issue, right? And so the debates play out quite explicitly in the tension between the two. For some, like structural violence, it was always more about power than about individual behavior. And for others, like I argue with linguistic violence or with epistemic violence, a closely related idea that I have a sort of working paper on, we can see a development over time away from a structure-oriented view towards a behavior-oriented one instead. On my view, the contemporary debates about the politics of language broadly, debates about censorship and expression, about hate speech and harm, about the ways that particular kinds of ideas in their dissemination, like reinscribe or challenge broader forms of power. I think that a lot of these debates about language really reflect these older debates about violence. And so what I've been trying to do in my work more recently is taking some of the lessons of that sort of 50-year history of conversations about violence and rethink some of our contemporary impasses around speech and harm, language and power in those terms.
What first drew you to these questions? Was there any particular, let's say, moment of engagement with any canonical thinker in political theory or any more recent work that you recall kind of putting you onto this path in the first place?
Yeah, so the origins of this interest go back a long time for me to an older interest in political nonviolence and in forms of especially religious pacifism. Some of my earlier work has looked at the dynamics of things like white Quaker nonviolence in apartheid Cape Town. That's what I did my master's thesis on. And my interest in political nonviolence at a certain point, especially in college and then early in grad school, became an interest in how we should understand the concept of nonviolence. It seemed to me that there was something of an uncertainty in how, like, the political traditions of civil disobedience and nonviolent power, and then in the resulting sort of intellectual communities that formed around them, there was an ambiguity there about whether the idea of nonviolence itself was best understood simply in opposition to violence, right? Is nonviolence just whatever doesn't have violence in it? Or was nonviolence a kind of provisional name for a new kind of social power that had been discovered? Gandhi's language of satyagraha was an attempt to move beyond the purely negative language of nonviolence toward the identification of like what this new kind of almost social technology was. Hannah Arendt's work that presented power and violence as opposites rather than as always intertwined was also an attempt to sort of think of nonviolence as a form of power in its own right, rather than just the absence of whatever violence is. And so for a while, my work was oriented towards trying to clarify the concept of nonviolence. But at the very moment when I felt as though I had sort of reached a conclusion to that question that was satisfactory to myself, I also realized that the question that it depended on, what is violence, right, was much less stable than I had taken it to be. And I became interested not in trying to settle the question of what violence is, right? How should we define the term? What's the best version of the concept? Instead, I became interested in the history of how that had become a problem at all. And so biographically, my interest in violence emerged from my interest in nonviolence. And then it turned out that as I dug into the history, I realized that actually that was also the case historically as well, that the concept of violence itself became a problem because nonviolence emerged as a possibility. And so that was where my work sort of took this turn that eventually led me into these questions now about the politics of language. Yeah.
Picking up on what you just said about the idea that violence is an unsettled concept in some ways and that it has this history. It seems like the concept of violence then has a rhetorical dimension to it that is difficult to disentangle from a purely descriptive or an analytical one. Would you agree with that kind of way of putting it?
Absolutely. So I think that the one of the best pieces of philosophical writing about the concept of violence itself is an essay by the philosopher Robert Paul Wolff from 1969 called On Violence. It shares its title with the much more well-known book by Arendt from the next year. But Wolff's essay basically argues that the concept of violence is intrinsically and necessarily confused. And he builds this argument through his own sort of skepticism of ideas about political authority and legitimacy. But the real force of the argument comes not from his own sort of account of um, the impossibility of political authority. He thinks the concept of violence is parasitic on the idea of illegitimacy, and he thinks that's an incoherent idea. But the real force of his argument, and the reason it became really influential in subsequent American philosophy, was that he points out that essentially people use the language of violence in this period, in around 1970, basically to describe political uses of force that they object to. But people object to political uses of force because of what their own interests are. And because people have different interests, it follows that there are different ideas of what violence is. And so he builds this argument that actually the language of violence is always a rhetorical technique in political debate, and that we can't settle any real philosophical questions about violence just by clarifying the language in itself. Instead, we have to move beyond the attempt to define the term towards an understanding of why people use it in the ways that they do, what that says about their understanding of their own interests and how those interests play out in society. In the years after Wolff's essay, the language of violence changed in a lot of ways and was directed towards new things. But I do think that the key insight there, that the concept of violence has this inextricably evaluative dimension, and that it's best understood not as something that can be sort of settled forever by like a better conceptual analysis, right? But that we have to understand how it operates in the concrete contestations of politics. I think that that's as true today as it was in 1969.
So maybe sticking a little bit with this time period of the 1960s, I think that kind of leads us to my next question, which was going to be the notions of structural violence and institutional violence that became prominent at this time. You note that basically these concepts were developed in a particularly active political period of contestation of the structures of political power as it existed, in not only in the United States but in other places as well. So, what were these concepts originally developed to describe and to critique? And can we get a little bit more specific about that?
Yeah. So the term structural violence, in the sort of usual sense, as a term for phenomena like economic inequality, has a pretty specific origin point. It traces back most directly to an article by the scholar Johann Galtung, who was one of the founders of the discipline of peace and conflict studies from the end of the 60s, called Violence, Peace, and Peace Research. And in this article, he basically gives this really complex typology of violence that distinguishes between personal violence, right, the violence of people attacking each other, and structural violence, which on his view is that form of violence evident in the sort of systematic conditions of a society that could be otherwise than how they are. Now, he was the first to sort of use this term in this way. Of course, he wasn't the first to develop this broader idea that violence was latent in the structure of a society. Figures in the New Left from the same period, like Dave Dellinger, had developed a language of the violence of the status quo. A philosopher named Newton Garver, who published what I believe to be the first post-war essay by an American academic about the concept of violence itself. The essay is called "What Violence Is." Had argued for a distinction between institutional and personal violence, which is very similar to Galtung's idea. And all of these figures were paying close attention to debates about whether racism had to be understood in personal or institutional terms. So Stokely Carmichael had delivered a lecture at the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London at the end of the 60s, which had been one of the ways in which the concept of institutional racism that he had been developing in this period became more widely known. Galtung cites that lecture in his essay on structural violence as a model for the kind of distinction between personal and institutional that he's developing. So there's this broader context in the 60s where, from the critique of American racism to the sort of broader dynamics of the New Left, the violence is becoming a tool, the concept of violence is becoming a tool for thinking about something beyond the merely individuated. What gave this some of its rhetorical power, and Galtung himself is pretty explicit about this in the Violence, Peace, and Peace Research essay. What gave this move its rhetorical power was that by using this language of violence, you could avoid sounding too much like a Marxist in a moment where it was quite politically complex to be publicly positioned as a Marxist in the American Academy. Galtung presents the language of structural violence explicitly as an alternative to what he views as the more politically charged language of exploitation. And I argue that something similar was at play in the development of new notions of linguistic and epistemic violence, especially in the late 70s and 80s. Marxism and Marxist theory traditionally had thought about the politics of language through the lens of the concept of ideology. But the concept of ideology, that sort of program, was increasingly in disarray in the 70s and 80s for complex intellectual and political reasons. And a lot of theorists, faced with the sort of confusion of the ideology approach to understanding language, turned as well to the language of violence as a tool for thinking about how discourse could be a sphere of power. And so you have figures like Gayatri Spivak, who introduced the term epistemic violence in the 80s. You have a sort of broader conversation around symbolic violence and the American reception of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's work. And of course, Foucault is kind of looming over this development in the American Academy, even though violence isn't really a technical term for him. So that's how I understand this sort of broader intellectual political context.
I think we can maybe stick with that train of thought. And since you brought in Spivak and Bourdieu and some of these figures, you also write in some of your work that this idea of epistemic violence, as you say, was developed as a systematic critique of imperialist discourse and of the processes of knowledge production that were, a component of that. So now, though, you note that it's been inverted into a more liberal and individualist framework to describe harmful personal behavior. So we've had this shift, it seems, from the systemic and the structural to the individual. So my two-part question is, what was the original intent of this idea of epistemic violence, and how and why did this shift towards a more individual reading of it take place over the following decades?
Yeah, so Spivak introduces the idea of epistemic violence at the end of the 80s in her really influential article, Can the Subaltern Speak? So this article, this essay is published in a volume called Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture, which grew out of a series of seminars in Chicago. And Spivak is picking up on problems and themes from the sort of longer history of ideology theory, and reinterpreting them in a moment in which those older categories are no longer no longer feel as coherent as they once had, perhaps. She uses the language of epistemic violence to give an account of how subaltern classes in contexts of colonialist domination are made illegible within the space of political concern. So what I mean by this is she gives this argument about how it is that particular oppressed and exploited groups, in the context of her specific case here is British imperialism in India. She gives this analysis of how uh, some people never actually become visible within politics as speaking subjects at all. Her answer to the question, can the subaltern speak, is no. The subaltern cannot speak because speech is a social, political relation, not simply an individual capacity for voice. And in contexts of colonial capitalist domination, the ability to be configured or figured as a speaking subject at all is not like universally guaranteed. Epistemic violence is Spivak's term for the processes that make this the case. You can see traces of it in the actions of individuals, in the distortions of particular ways of speaking, or of representing. But it's a fundamentally sort of structural process. This was an incredibly influential essay, and the language of epistemic violence sort of disseminated broadly across post-colonial theory and aspects of feminist theory and social philosophy more broadly. But it took on this sort of wider reception against the backdrop of a set of both political and intellectual developments that sort of primed it for reconfiguration to new ends. So intellectually, Spivak was writing really with reference to sort of Marxian structural theories of ideology and discourse. But the broader American context that was so receptive to her ideas had been really deeply influenced in this period by the rise of speech act theory, which was an approach to language pioneered by the British philosopher J.L. Austin, that was focused on what people do with their words, not just what they communicate. Austin invented the idea of performative speech. He discovered, in this sense, that sometimes when we say something, we're not trying to describe a state of affairs. We're actually bringing it into existence. His canonical example was the "I do" of the wedding ceremony. When you say "I do," you're not describing a marriage; you're actually causing it to happen. Austin's account of performative speech was as influential outside of American analytical philosophy as it was inside it. It got picked up by figures like Judith Butler for new uses in the study of gender and sexuality. And what it made sort of axiomatic for huge sectors of the American humanities was the idea that if words can be deeds, then they can also be harms. And so Austin was an incredibly powerful resource for feminist theorists who wanted to reconceptualize the political harms of pornography and sexual harassment. It was an incredibly powerful resource for the rise of theories of hate speech and critical race theory, and presented this sort of set of intellectual resources for the study of harmful kinds of individual behavior. Meanwhile, there was a broader sort of individualization of political ideas going on in this period because of the influence of what social and political theorists often refer to as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is usually understood in sort of two distinct senses. On the one hand, there's a kind of economic institutional sense that emphasizes austerity politics, financialization, structural adjustment policies. And then there's a kind of Foucauldian sense that understands neoliberalism as a form of political reason, as a mode of everyday common sense, in which under its influence we more and more think and act like market subjects, like calculating utilitarian rational actors in all of our activities, not just explicitly economic ones. Wendy Brown is the sort of one of the foremost theorists of neoliberalism in that sort of discourse and rationality oriented sense. And in her book, Undoing the Demos, from a few years ago, she gives a really powerful account of how it is that this sort of mode of neoliberalism becomes an everyday kind of common sense that pushes us to think about everything in terms of individuated interactions, individual behaviors. It's a perspective on the world that makes the structural harder and harder to see. Now, for complex reasons, I think that this kind of individualizing neoliberal sensibility has shaped academic discourse on the left much more than most of us who are academics on the left, like me, want to think. Because essentially, under social conditions of neoliberalism, any critique of power is going to be more immediately legible and more immediately intelligible insofar as it has a kind of concrete payoff in relation to individual activity and behavior. The ideas just make more sense when we can reframe them in these terms, because those are the terms increasingly of everyday experience in a world that is more sort of individualized and atomized than it ever has been before, as a result of the concrete institutional developments and political economy of neoliberalism. And so, caught between these two sort of developments, a sort of turn towards individualization in all of our moral ideas as a result of these developments, and the specific insights of the Speech Act theory that came to prominence around the same time, it shouldn't be surprising that Spivak's idea of epistemic violence would be sort of powerfully and usefully rearticulated as a category of individuated behavior. And this is how the term essentially functions in contemporary American philosophy, and in sort of conversations around many forms of activism and elsewhere. Epistemic violence has become a really useful tool for theorizing the harms of certain kinds of situated disrespect to other people's experience and their modes of knowledge of the world. I think that this is a real insight, that there is a fundamental ethical and moral insight in this redevelopment of the term. What I'm also interested in thinking about in my work is how we can hold that ethical individual insight together with the emphasis on the structural, the systematic, the systemic, that on its own terms, I think it risks making it harder to see. It is not obvious at the level of concepts or at the level of theory how to combine Spivak's sense of epistemic violence as systematic form of power in discourse and knowledge with the sort of Speech Act sense that the term has taken on. But this isn't just a contradiction at the level of like abstract philosophy. It's also a real tension in concrete political action and activism, right? These are difficult conversations to know how to have. And I think anyone who's been in sort of organizing spaces, it has some experience of how hard it can be to think simultaneously about the ethics of the behavioral and the politics of the structural. It doesn't have to be like impossible to hold these things together, but in practice, it often ends up being difficult to do so. And I'm interested in why that's the case and in how we can sort of think beyond that impasse. I'm not interested, I think it would be impossible to simply return to an older structure only view. There are fundamental insights in the turn to Speech Acts, in the sort of emphasis on the ethics of respect and disrespect that we see in the new use of epistemic violence. But I worry that sometimes that ethical mode makes it easier to ask how we can be better people. It sometimes makes it harder to understand how we can move from the work of becoming a better person to the task of building a better world. I don't have, answers to these questions, but I'm trying to figure out how how to pose these questions in ways that can maybe get beyond some of the apparent contradictions.
It's a wonderful, detailed answer. I was wondering if we can stay on this topic for the last couple of questions that I had, which has to do with the actual, you could say, technological and social changes that have defined what we call the neoliberal period. And I think, especially within the last decade or so, the rise of social media as something that has facilitated this kind of atomization that then enables the prominence of the framework of epistemic violence as an individual and liberal uh, way of engaging with others. So, how has social media transformed what we consider to be violent language?
This is a phenomenal question because it's an incredibly complex one, and there's a kind of surface level answer to the question, how has social media transformed what we think of as violent language, which is that, there are all kinds of hate speech that operate online that have like proliferated in new ways because of the specific kinds of regulation and non-regulation of platforms, the way in which spaces like Twitter and Facebook have become public spheres that are managed entirely by private hands. And this is a really complicated set of social dynamics that have emerged. But I think there's a deeper question as well that has to do with the underlying economic process of which these things are only symptoms, and of which I actually think neoliberalism itself, in both its senses, the sense of individualizing common sense and the institutional sense of financialization and whatever else. I think neoliberalism is a symptom of this as well, and it's the radical transformation of economic production and distribution and exchange that was occasioned by the so-called information revolution in the wake of the Second World War. As early as the 1970s, Jean-Francois Lyotard's book, The Postmodern Condition, which is usually remembered for its analysis of the collapse of the meta-narratives, the grand stories that we tell ourselves to legitimate knowledge, and the rise of a kind of postmodern skepticism in the wake of that collapse. That's what his book is remembered for. But already in the 70s, he was telling that story within the context of a bigger problem that book begins with, but which has largely been forgotten in its reception. And it's this: Lyotard thinks that the big stories, the grand narratives, have collapsed because information and knowledge themselves have become commodities. And information and knowledge have been commodified, on Lyotard's view, because of what he's already in the 70s calling the computerization of society. I think that a fundamental task for my own field of political theory in the present is to make sense of how radically all of the oldest concepts of political thought are being transformed by the thing that we think of as the information revolution. Computerization made neoliberalism possible. It made financialization possible. It made the forms of social science and of statistical knowledge about society that made the dismantling of the welfare state possible. And the so-called computerization of society is the condition of possibility for these new sort of quasi-public spheres, and sort of most straightforwardly. And I think that this is one reason that concepts like violence in general, or epistemic violence, or linguistic violence in particular, feel as though they're in such deep disarray. Let me give a sort of concrete example, because that's like a big picture story. And to be honest, that's like me sort of thinking out loud about the kinds of problems that I want to start working on next. These are the problems that the study of violence has taken me to. So let me give a more concrete example. With epistemic violence, in Spivak's view, epistemic violence is kind of a version of harm against the body, violence against the body, even though it's totally structuralized, right? It's a structure, it's a structural concept for Spivak, but it has to do with how some bodies don't even become visible in politics at all. Harm to the body was one of the old ways of understanding violence across the whole liberal tradition of political thought, the social contract tradition, the democratic tradition. But another way of understanding violence traditionally in Anglophone political thought was as damage to property. Spivak's sense of epistemic violence doesn't really have much to do with property. It has to do with the subject. But I think that there's a certain way in which the new sense of epistemic violence as a form of harm to people's self-understanding does actually reactivate this older idea of violence as property destruction. Because if knowledge has been commodified in our world today, self-knowledge has too. Certainly in ways that push against the logic of neoliberalism, right? People capitalize on their own individual experiences in order to resist the kinds of exploitation and domination that neoliberalism inscribes. This is one reason that I'm a little bit skeptical of the attempt to explain all social developments in terms of neoliberalism, because I think that neoliberalism is just one symptom of this broader social process. And so sometimes people sort of turn their self-knowledge into social capital, right, which is an economic category in a certain sense, in order to resist neoliberal power. And when they do that, their self-knowledge becomes almost a kind of property that can be damaged by other people's discursive disrespect. And so this is a super sort of schematic account of what's going on here. But I think there's a certain way in which the contemporary sense of epistemic violence as acts that sort of damage the intelligibility of someone else's self-knowledge actually has something to do with the way that the old liberal idea of violence as property destruction gets reconfigured in the conditions of the present, when knowledge itself has economic salience in a new way.
Yeah, that's really fantastic insight. Maybe staying on this track for the final question that I had, was thinking about what you call the kind of the post-war revolution in technology that facilitated some of these tendencies. Arguably, now we're entering into an even more radical period of the intensification of these kinds of social relations. You've written, for example, a little bit about how this pandemic has amplified the presence of surveillance technology in our daily lives. And you write that this is no longer about surveillance as such, but it's actually a kind of new infrastructure for the technological reorganization of society. So maybe this would be a kind of a good point to close on, because it brings us right to the present and to the very strange year that we've all had. But can you walk us through a little bit of what you mean by these shifts?
I think that the sort of tech critical discourse today, right? The skepticism about big technology companies and so on, that focuses on surveillance, for example, as the key problem, certainly has important political insights to offer, but also underestimates the significance of what's going on. You know, we all sort of, I think, take it for granted almost at this point that things like Facebook and as a platform, and Google as a mail service and a search service, that these are technologies that surveil us in a certain way. You know, they track our activities in order to make money by more effectively advertising to us. And that's true, and there are problems with that, obviously. But the concept of surveillance as the description of what's happening here sort of underrates how profound the transformation of our whole mode of social relations has been. Because the very technologies that we know have this kind of surveillance logic to them are also the technologies that structure the most fundamental forms of social interaction now that we engage in. This has become all the more true in the pandemic, with our reliance on Zoom and other kinds of modes of digital connection. But even before that, I mean, all of the things that we think of as surveillance technologies, advertising technologies, were also just forms of social infrastructure. And it seems to me that this is a development in which concepts like it's not as though we have like threats to privacy. We do. There are threats to privacy. But part of the reason that they're so difficult to grapple with politically is that the very concept of what privacy could mean is changing today. This is why I think sometimes political theorists and others are fond of saying that the information revolution was as big a deal in the 20th century as the Industrial Revolution was in the 19th, right? The invention of the computer network or the computer cluster transformed things as much as the factory did. But I actually think that understates how big a deal some of the shifts are. I think that the information revolution is more like the invention of the city thousands of years ago, because the city was a technology of proximity, right? It was a restructuring of social relations. A certain kind of privacy disappears in the city because you live really close to other people. You can't be unseen in the same way. But a new kind of privacy also becomes possible with the city. The privacy of the crowd, the privacy of anonymity in the mass. A revolution in our very structure of spatial relations, as profound as that of the city, it would be wrong to think of that as like a threat to privacy. It's a transformation of what it means. And I think that that's true of the so-called information age as well, that we've changed what it means to be close to or distant from another person. But the difficulty is that we're in the middle of this revolution of our very forms of social space. And in general, the concepts that we use to make sense of social changes become clear only in retrospect. It took decades after the invention of the factory for a systematic analysis, let alone critique, of the societies that the factory had made possible to become available. And so we face today this problem in which we're living through a transformation of our social and economic and political relations that may very well be more dramatic than those of the 19th century. And so in my view, it's not even that we don't have the answers to the problems of our time. It's that we're not even sure yet how to ask the questions. And so I think of my work as hopefully making some kind of contribution to what will be a really long effort just to reformulate how we make sense of our oldest political problems at all under conditions in which the ideas that we use to ask those questions can't mean the same things that they used to. So the concept of surveillance itself might be inadequate to an understanding of the surveillance technologies of our time.
Matt Schaefer, thank you again for joining the Mitchell Center podcast for this really fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.